Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was Joseph. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were working in the fields. Joseph's brothers resented him, and when they saw him coming, they attacked him and threw him in a well. Then they sold their brother as a slave, took off his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, tricking him into believing a wild animal had killed Joseph. Soon after, Joseph was sold to a military official in Egypt as a servant. God helped Joseph do great work, and the official was very happy with him. Joseph was very handsome, and the official's wife tried day after day to seduce him. One day, she pressured Joseph so much that he ran out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She told everyone that he tried to force himself on her. The official was furious and threw Joseph in jail. God once again helped Joseph in all he did. And eventually he was put in charge of all the prisoners. Joseph had the special ability to interpret people's dreams. One day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. He dreamed that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and 7 heads of healthy grain were eaten up by 7 heads of dried up grain. God helped Joseph interpret the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of successful farming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was impressed and put Joseph second in charge of Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food. When they got there, they met with Joseph, but didn't recognize him right away. When Joseph finally told them who he was, they wept because they were sorry for what they had done. Eventually, they went and got their father Jacob and brought him back to Egypt. Joseph took care of his entire family, giving them property in the best part of the land where they lived for the rest of their lives.
So, for about 30 minutes last night, I thought I was going to get to experience one of the best sermons I've ever preached. I was waiting, like most of you, on a game to start. Fox News on the bottom, not Fox News, Fox's station on the bottom had a little ticker that said, the Nebraska game has been postponed and will be played at 10:30 a.m. Most of you were excited about this. I was also excited because I knew during this time, I would get more cheers and claps that I had ever gotten in a message as you sat on your phones, and every time there was a touchdown, you'd be like, yeah, go! And I would have been so excited to keep preaching and preaching. So feel free to cheer a little bit this morning, a few amens. Yeah, that's good. You didn't get it out of your system. And then I quickly thought about the story of Joseph that I was going to be talking about today. We see in Joseph's life, and we'll walk through his life, a lot of disappointment. I thought, man, I get to hang out with a lot of disappointed people this morning. Maybe this message will be something that they can hear from. Maybe God just positioned us people in Nebraska to hear from him a little bit more this morning. And so as we talk about disappointment today and we jump into Joseph's story, I'm excited to see how God works in the middle of that. This week we celebrated a pretty cool anniversary. 55 years ago on August 28th, 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King had 250,000 people on the Washington Monument. And he said some words that would be forever etched in American history. He started a speech with the words, I have a dream. I have a dream. Dreams are powerful, powerful things. And on that day, Dr. Martin Luther King, he gave a powerful speech, a speech talking about one day in this country, we would live in a place that people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. He talked about this beautiful reality, this beautiful hope, this vision for a better place. Here in 2018, we live on the other side of that dream in some ways. We live in a place that is better and has moved the needle a long way as far as a racial reconciliation and things like that, but we also live in a place that hasn't fully seen that dream realized. In the last 100 years, I don't think it's going out on a limb to say Dr. Martin Luther King was the most famous dreamer that we know of. We all have heard that speech. We celebrated this last week. As I said, we got to celebrate that. But today, I think we've got a guy that one-ups Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his dream. Probably the most famous dreamer of all times. And most of you have heard of this guy as well. And so sometimes when we hear these stories, if you're like me, we're tempted to say, hey, I get it. I know the story. I know what happens. We just watched the video. Nothing new there. But I want to challenge you, especially today and as you read the story, to ask God, what do you have for me this week? What do you have for me this morning? I believe that God's word is living and it's active, and he wants to speak to you this morning. He wants to speak to you through Joseph's story. Joseph, a guy who, like we said, was from a huge family. He had Jacob had 12 sons, and Joseph had 11 brothers. He was the favorite of all of those. I come from a pretty large family as well, and so I know what it's like to have some sibling rivalry. I won't tell you that I know what it's like to be the favorite, because I've got siblings here this morning, and I don't want them to get offended, but that's where we find Joseph in the beginning of this story. We find him as the favorite of his dad. His dad gives him this coat to symbolize that he's the favorite. And for us, we're like, a coat? What? That doesn't make sense. How does that symbolize him as the favorite? It'd be like you guys, Christmas morning, sitting around with your siblings, and you're so pumped up for the presents that you got. You go unwrap your present, and you're like, bubble gum, this is awesome. My parents love me so much. I got bubble gum. And then the next sibling goes by, and they unwrap their present of bubble gum, and you're like, this is my favorite flavor, awesome. And it keeps going on that way. And all of a sudden, it's Joseph's turn, and he unwraps an iPhone. And you're like, are you kidding me? Dad, he's obviously your favorite. And so we see this happen in Joseph's life. And Joseph is out, he hangs out at home a lot. He's his dad's favorite. His dad sends his brothers out into the field to go work and get sweaty and tend to the fields. And then we see Joseph one day as the favorite running out to the field. And Joseph had done a few things. Not only was he the favorite, he was a dreamer. And a lot of times in the Old Testament, we saw that God talked through dreams. We saw this in Abraham's story as well. And so God talked to Joseph through a dream one time. And Joseph was so excited to tell his brothers about this awesome dream because he was the favorite. And he's like, hey guys, guess what? And they're like, I don't want to hear it. But he insisted. One day, God told me, you're going to bow down to me. Isn't that so cool? And the guys are not entertained by this at all. And so it creates this sibling rivalry. I mean, his family was a mess if you read the story. He's got a dad who's got a few wives, and he's got brothers from all these different baby mamas, and so much drama inside of this story. And so when Joseph is running out to hang out with his brothers one day, it's not a surprise that these guys aren't really a fan of Joseph. And so that's where we'll pick up the story today. It'll be on page 29 and 30 as we kick off in your story. And if you're in your Bible, it'll be Genesis 37. The brothers say, here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. And then, say, a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what become of those dreams. So these guys, this wasn't just a sibling rivalry at your house. These guys wanted him dead. They really actually wanted him dead. It was such a twisted, weird family scenario that they wanted this guy dead, but by the grace of God, one of his brothers had maybe a better idea. It was probably actually a selfish idea as we continue to read. It says, Judah said to his brothers, hey guys, what are we going to gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother. He's our flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. See, this was a brilliant plan, actually. It was a win-win-win kind of scenario because what happened here is we see if they would have just killed him, like they gained nothing besides him just being away, which was part of what they wanted to happen. But if they just killed him, he would be gone. They read another story about another brother that killed his brother a little bit earlier, and they would have known that story, and they're like, things didn't go well for that guy, so maybe let's think of a different plan. We don't have to have the blood on our hands, so that's a win. We can get money. If we killed him, we wouldn't get any money out of the deal, but now we can sell him and get money. That's awesome. And then we can get rid of him, which is the ultimate goal. And so that's what they did. And then, like guys who should have won the first Oscar ever, they take the coat of their brother, they go kill an animal, and they come up to Dad at dinner, and they're like, Dad, we don't know what happened. We found his coat. There's blood on it. I think he's dead. Is this his coat? And Dad's like, yeah, that's his coat. And Dad is just wrecked. Dad is wrecked because not only did one of his sons die, but his favorite son just died. And so as Dad is wrecked, Joseph is finding himself in the middle of being an immigrant slave headed to Egypt. And that's what he becomes, as a slave. He enters a chapter of his life titled Disappointment. He was in a chapter of his life after having all these dreams, these hopes, this grand future, the guy who was the favorite, and his brothers were going to bow down to him, and now he finds himself distant from his family, distant from the dreams, and in a chapter titled Disappointment in his life. Anyone ever been there? In a chapter of your life titled Disappointment? I know for me, I've had a few of those chapters. One of the most memorable for me was wrapping up my freshman year of Bible college, and there was just this series of events. I had been a guy who went to Bible college. I felt the call to do ministry, to become a pastor, and so I was doing it. I was in Bible college, and I remember going home one day to do laundry, and some guys in suits showing up at my house to tell me this crazy accusation had been made about one of my best friends, and all of a sudden he found himself in the middle of a murder trial. And I got to go to the courtroom and testify for that. I was broken. I remember in that same year, not too long after that, sitting down with one of my siblings who explained, hey, I'm really struggling with my sexuality. I'm struggling with my identity and feeling like, hey, I was born a totally different way, and really wrestling through that. Another sibling had made some poor decisions and had run away and was doing some drugs. And I remember a little later after that getting a phone call from my parents as my grandma was on a vacation. Brain aneurysm. Dead. I remember being a guy in Bible college studying to do ministry and watching my world and all the people I loved fall apart and wondering, God, I don't think you can use me. I was living in a chapter of my life titled Disappointment, and here's what often happens to me, and I think to a lot of us when we live in chapters of our life with that title. When we live in chapters of our life titled Disappointment, disappointment tends to drive doubt, doesn't it? When you're in the middle of disappointment, you're like, what is happening? I didn't do anything to deserve this, and you start to doubt God's plan for you. I certainly did. God, are you sure that you've called me into this? If the people this close to me are messing up, if I can't minister to them, I don't think I can do this. You've got the wrong guy. And so I started to doubt, and I started to try to do things my own way. Maybe this morning you are in a chapter titled Disappointment. The subtitle might be Singleness. You're like, hey, I never thought I'd be this single this long. I thought I would be married by now. Or maybe yours is in your marriage. Your dream for your marriage was something a little different than what is reality. You haven't had your husband love you for a while and show affection. Your wife hasn't met your needs in a while, and so you're doubting that this is for you. You're doubting that those vows you made are any good. You've dreamed of a family. You've tried everything, and it's just not happening. It's not working, and you see everyone's Facebook posts, and they're celebrating, and you're grieving. God, are you sure this is for me? You lost the client or the job, and the dreams for your future have fallen apart in just a moment. Your kids have left the church and left Jesus, and your plans for your future and their future are messed up. You didn't make the team this last fall, or the show choir that you tried your hardest to make, and you are living in a chapter of your life titled Disappointment. This is where Joseph was in the middle of his story, but we see he responds in some kind of different way. We see that as the story continues, and he is a slave. He becomes a slave of that guy named Potiphar, And Potiphar is this guy with a lot of power. He's in charge of the bodyguard for a guy named Pharaoh, who's the most powerful man in the world, human history at this time. And Potiphar notices something different about Joseph. He notices that though he's a slave and though he's going to remain a slave, he starts to elevate him into another position. He says, hey, I'm going to make this guy in charge of the rest of the slaves, the rest of the guys that work for me. And we see his faithfulness continue to happen there, Joseph's faithfulness, and we see God being faithful to him. And he raises him up, still a slave, but in charge of all the rest of these guys, in charge of Potiphar's whole business. And it says that Potiphar, when Joseph was in charge, he worried about nothing, that things just flourished where Joseph was. And then, like any daytime soap opera, things took a little bit of a weird turn. He's hanging out at Potiphar's house a lot, as he does. He's the head of his household. And then the Bible tells us that Joseph was handsome and well-built. And so while Potiphar notices something special about Joseph, Potiphar's wife also notices something special about Joseph. And she becomes interested in him, and she begins to slide into his DMs a little bit, starts to hit on him. And she starts to invite him to sleepovers, and they weren't going to be slumber parties in her mind. And Joseph's like, what is happening here? And Joseph, probably maybe facing some doubt in this moment, definitely living in disappointment, he could have been tempted to give in to that, but we see Joseph do something else. We see Joseph's response as we continue on in the story. He says to her, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Joseph refused. I don't know if you caught that, but that is crazy to me. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? When I'm in disappointing parts of my life, I'm like, how could God do this to me? Man, I have done nothing wrong. I've done nothing to deserve this. What about me? How could God let this happen to me? And so Joseph has this new temptation in the middle of being driven to maybe doubt, but we see something else that happens, I think, oftentimes in our life. We see that doubt drives disobedience. Ever been there? You started out disappointed, and you started to doubt God's plan for you, doubt that he's good, doubt that he loves you, doubt that the dreams that he gave you are going to happen. And the more you wrestle with doubt, the more you want to take on disobedience. You want to try things your own way. I know certainly in that season of my life in college, I started to try things my own way. I started to cut corners in places I never thought I would, compromise in places I never thought I would. I ended up leaving school actually for a season and transferring and just doing stupid things because I doubted God and I was disappointed and I just wanted to do things my own way, and I started to disobey his plan for me in life. I don't know if you've ever found yourself there in the middle of that temptation. That's certainly where Joseph was. He had the temptation to disobey in the middle of his disappointment, but he didn't. And so we see Joseph respond in a totally different way here. He says, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? How could I do that right there? He stays faithful to God. He says, hey, I know that God has given me something, and I want to stay faithful to him, even though maybe it doesn't feel like he's being faithful to me, but he trusted. And so we see this happen. And Joseph goes on a different turn than even he saw modeled in his own life. You remember his great-grandfather, Abraham, a man known with great faith, but he had a promise. He had a dream one day. He had a dream that as he looked out at the stars in the sky, God said, hey, dude, you're going to have more descendants than this. And Abraham's like, I do not know how that's going to happen. And a year goes by, and another year goes by, and another year goes by, and they're not getting any younger at this point, and things are looking more and more bleak for him to start this family, to even have one kid, let alone as many as the stars in the sky and his descendants. And so he's driven to doubt God's plan a little bit, right? He takes things into his own hands, and through an act of disobedience, he hooks up with one of the servants and has a baby, and he sees that model. He sees that modeled in his own dad's life, Jacob. disappointed in the way he was born and where he landed in the family. And so what's he do? He's driven to ultimately disobedience because he tries to cover up and take his brother's birthright, and he sells this whole story to his blind dad, and he's driven to disobedience. Yet Joseph takes a different turn than these other guys. He stays faithful. And so the story continues on, and we see that things heat up between Potiphar's wife, and she really makes Joseph her pursuit. So much so that he's walking around, and one day she grabs him by the coat, and he ducks out of the coat. He runs away, leaves the coat behind, not knowing what was going to happen next. He was going to get accused of something he didn't do. Accused of trying to take advantage of his boss's wife. He had been elevated to like the top guy in his boss's company, and then all of a sudden he's busted by his boss, who happens to be the chief executioner in the land of Egypt. Not a good scenario. Often in Egypt at this time, they were quick to execute people. We see this with a baker later on, that 3 days later, this guy's head's off, he's done. It didn't take much for people to execute people, but in some act of God's grace, Potiphar decides to send Joseph to a dungeon. To a dungeon where he would be separated. He went from slave to maybe working himself up, and now he's in prison. He's in prison for something he didn't do. And I think we can be okay sometimes in life. We'll read in the story about people who make poor decisions, and they get what's coming to them. You know, you make a poor decision, you cheat on your taxes, or you cheat on your wife, you cheat on your spouse, you make poor decisions, and you've got things coming to you, and we can be okay with that. We'll read about that more in the story as it continues. But sometimes what's hard for us to wrestle with is, what about the person who did nothing to deserve it? What about that guy? What about Joseph, who all of a sudden finds himself in the middle of a dungeon and he's done nothing to deserve it? Where is God in the middle of this? In the middle of this injustice? And the story continues on, and the warden of the prison, he sees this same special thing inside of Joseph that other people had seen. And so he makes him in charge of the dungeon of 3. A couple other prisoners are down there. There's a cupbearer of Pharaoh's, and the cupbearer, his job was to drink the wine before Pharaoh would, and if he died, then they would know, hey, we don't serve this to Pharaoh, so that was his job. And then there was a baker, and he baked things, and he finds himself there, and these guys are hanging out, the 3 of them, 3 amigos inside of prison, sharing stories. They get to know each other. Now all of a sudden these 2 guys have a dream on the same night. And like some kind of riddle, they're telling their dream, hoping somebody could interpret the dream or maybe at least solve it. And then we see something happen. We see that God is with Joseph because he gives him an interpretation to that dream. We see that in chapter 39 of Genesis that God is with Joseph a few times. When he was a slave, it says the Lord was with Joseph. Again, it says, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. And the Lord gave him this interpretation for a dream. And so he interprets these dreams of these 2 guys. One of them is a really good interpretation for the guy. He ends up being the cupbearer to Pharaoh. Once again, he's in Pharaoh's ear. The other guy off with his head 3 days later. But the reality is both of them come true. They're both out of prison and out of the dungeon. But Joseph's stuck there. Joseph's stuck in the dungeon for a couple years. This is a 13-year waiting game. This is a 13-year story of his life titled Disappointment. This wasn't just a week waiting for a new kickoff. This was a 13-year disappointment in the life of Joseph. Maybe for you, you are in the middle of a long, long disappointment. That's just where you're at in life. And the subtitle is loss, it's hurt, it's betrayal, it's abuse. Maybe it's terminal. And you're wondering, God, where are you in the middle of this? But we see in Joseph's story that the Lord was with Joseph. And as the story continues on, we see where the Lord is with us in the middle of the story. The Lord was with Joseph. And so the story continues on. Joseph still finds himself in the middle of the dungeon. These guys are out. Pharaoh starts having dreams. He's got two dreams, one of a really good dream of plenty and 7 years of plenty that Joseph ends up hearing from God and interpreting eventually, and the other is another dream. And Pharaoh, he's perplexed. He's the most powerful man in the world, and he shouldn't be perplexed. He should always have vision and know what's happening, and so he wants to know what in the world is happening. What do these dreams mean? So he recruits all the guys that he would normally recruit, the guys who are wise men that should have known what the dream meant. And they all come, and one by one, they strike out. Nothing. They don't have it. Joseph's down in the dungeon, and the cupbearer who would have been hearing all this commotion and knowing what would have been happening in Pharaoh's ear, he's like, "Hey, Pharaoh, come here for a second. I know a guy. Okay, you're going to have to hear me out. You're going to have to hear me out. I met a guy in prison once, okay? And, yeah, so me and the baker, we were down there, the guy you killed, and we were down there, and this guy, we told him our dreams, and he interpreted them. Like, he told me I'd be hanging out with you again. He told me you were going to kill that other guy. I knew it in advance. We already had a funeral for him a few days earlier, and, hey, so this is crazy, but you might want to ask him what's going on. And so in this amazing sheer act of grace, Pharaoh is now listening to a slave who became a prisoner about his dreams. We see God again give the interpretation to Joseph for the dreams. In the midst of the dungeon, God is with him. So he gives them this interpretation, and the story goes on. There's 7 great years, and that's awesome. And as Pharaoh hears the dream, he notices something special again about this guy, Joseph. And we pick up the story there in Genesis 41. It's on page 33 of your story. It says, "So Pharaoh asked them, after all the dream is interpreted, 'Can we find anyone like this man? One whom is the Spirit of God.'" The Lord was with Joseph. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You're going to be in charge of my palace, and all my people are going to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Over and over, we see the key ingredient in Joseph's life in the midst of disappointment is faithfulness. Faithfulness. He's faithful to the dream that God's given him. He's faithful not to compromise and get sucked in by doubt and disobedience. He is faithful, and we see what happens every time there's faithfulness. Faithfulness fosters flourishing. When we are faithful to God, it fosters flourishing. And God is always faithful to us. In the midst of his darkest, deepest disappointments, God was always there, and God stayed faithful. And as God stayed faithful, Joseph stayed faithful to God, and we see amazing things happen. Maybe you're in that chapter titled Disappointment. I want to encourage you, be faithful. Be faithful, because God is going to be faithful to you. Don't be driven to doubt, and don't let your doubt drive you to disobedience, but be faithful. Because maybe like Joseph, your faithfulness will be the catalyst to your freedom. And maybe for you, like Joseph, the dungeon is where you have to go in order to realize your dreams. This is amazing, people, that Joseph was all of a sudden the second most powerful man in the world. I don't know if there was like a corporate ladder that you could climb inside of Egypt, but this certainly would not have been the corporate ladder way to become the second in charge, the vice president of Egypt, to be a slave who became a prisoner in a dungeon, and yet the dungeon was the only way for him to become the second most powerful man in the world. I don't think you could have drawn up a different story where he would have climbed that corporate ladder except through the dungeon and being faithful to God. And really, God's the hero of the story, and we just get to see that play out in the life of Joseph. And so maybe you need to hear that today. Maybe for you, your faithfulness is what's going to be the catalyst to your freedom. Maybe in the middle of your dungeon, you need to realize that your dungeon is the way for your dream to be realized. We see all of this happen. We see the story unfold more. Joseph's brothers end up coming to him because there's a famine in the land. Another dream being realized, and this famine happens, 7 years of nothing. And not only is it affecting Egypt, the longer it goes, it's affecting people on the outskirts, the people where Joseph was originally from. Joseph's family's got everything they could ever want and need. They've got land, they've got money, they've got everything that a person can want and need except food. See, the famine was so great that the one thing they needed to survive, the one thing they couldn't just buy, they didn't have. And so they find themselves going to Egypt where they've heard that there's a stockpile of food. They find themselves prostrate at the feet of this guy that they have no clue who he is for a while, named Joseph. Bowing down to him, this dream is finally being realized. They have no clue. Joseph gives them a series of tests, and ultimately we see they go back, and Joseph recruits everybody to come, and because of Joseph's faithfulness, not only was Joseph saved, because of Joseph's faithfulness, not only was Joseph's family saved, because of his faithfulness, because of God's faithfulness, a whole nation was saved. See, what Joseph could have done was when these guys came, he could have said, hey guys, let me tell you about the last 13 years. And he could have just ripped them a new one. He could have said, hey guys, you know what I have been through because of you? We see a different response though. We don't see him hoarding the things that he has and saying, hey, go back and die hungry. No, we see him give out grace freely to the guys who put him through all of the trouble, the guys who betrayed him, the guys who sold him for money. Anyone remember another similar story? Another J name, a guy named Jesus? Jesus, a guy who has been betrayed and sold for money, a guy that people send into disappointing places, a guy who, worse than a dungeon, has to go to death because of what people did to him, because of their unfaithfulness to him, yet he beats it. And we're all in this room because of the faithfulness of God. Because of the faithfulness of Jesus. And we see Jesus came to ultimately die. And because of his sacrifice, and because he didn't say to all of us who are messed up, all of us who sinned and put him on the cross in the first place, he didn't say, hey, I'm going to hold this back from you. He didn't say, I'm going to hoard this. He said, I'm going to give it to you freely. Though you do not deserve it, I'm going to give it to you like Joseph did. And we see that's what Jesus did. Because see, here's what Jesus didn't come to do. Jesus did not come to keep you from pain. Jesus came to give you a way through it. Maybe you're in the midst of pain right now, and he didn't come to just keep you and shield you from pain, but he came to give you a way through the pain. Through his death, through his resurrection, that is what he came to do. That is the good news of the gospel, ladies and gentlemen, that Jesus ultimately, like Joseph, came to free a lot of people that messed him up, the people that sent him through the dungeon and through death in the first place, because he wanted you to have life. I think there's probably two different groups of people here today. One of you in the middle of the mess. I might even put myself in that category, thinking of the last year of my life, just losing some people that I love, losing some great leadership, losing people that I love to do ministry with, losing a lot of things, wondering, God, where in the world are you? Maybe you're like me and you may find yourself in the middle of the mess today, and I want to encourage you to be faithful. Like the song said earlier, he is faithful to the end, and he wants to be with you. And maybe that's what you needed to hear this morning, is that in the middle of your mess, God is with you, and your faithfulness is going to be the catalyst to your freedom. I think the other group of people might be the other lesson we learned from Joseph is, here's what happens sometimes when we get through the mess. Because we all have messes in our life. We all have chapters titled disappointment. Is we get through those and we become hoarders. We're like, I don't ever want to go back there, because last time I was vulnerable and I told people about the dreams that God had given me, I ended up in this mess. And finally, I got rescued from this mess. I'm not going to be vulnerable again. I'm not going to tell people about this thing because I don't want to end up back there. And then we become all of a sudden hoarders of hope. But that's not what that's not the route he took. His brothers who messed him up and did that, he was vulnerable with them, he loved them, and he gave out hope freely that they didn't deserve. Friends, you have neighbors and coworkers. We have a city of people that need to know about the hope that is in the message of Jesus Christ. And because we don't want to be offensive, or because we care about what our reputation might look like, or all those things, we kind of hoard it, don't we? So maybe you're a person that's on the other side of that, and your temptation is to hoard your hope. Friends, I encourage you, I implore you, do not be hoarders of hope. But as our friends from Mission Church said, we have to be hope dealers. That's what disciples of Jesus are. We are hope dealers. When we see people that are hopeless, we give them hope through the message and the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we have big things and we celebrate baptism, because that is where we find our hope in Jesus Christ. That is what baptism is about. It's a celebration of that hope. Stories of hope being found. And so if you're somebody who's found that hope, maybe that's what you need to do, is sign up to be baptized and go public with the hope that you found, not caring what other people are going to think about you, but to be a hope dealer. Friends, that is my hope. No matter what camp you're in this morning, that you'd be faithful and your faithfulness would follow flourishing, that you would not be tempted to be a hoarder of hope. Before I close and pray, I want to read something from Romans that I was reading in my devotion this week that just reminded me of the story. It reminded me of Joseph's story. It reminded me why it's important for us to go back and read these stories in the Old Testament and not just stick to Jesus, who is awesome, but why we get to stick and read these things. Paul says in Romans 15:4, he says, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in scriptures and the encouragement they provided, we might have hope." As you read this story, my hope is that you will have hope. As you read of the faithfulness of people like Joseph and Moses and David, that you would look for glimpses of hope. And then as you look back on your story like Joseph does at the end of it, you'd be able to look back and say, hey, these people intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Your story could lead to not just your life being changed, but the lives of your neighbors and your family members and your coworkers. It's the good news of the gospel. It's why we have a sign that says, and now you're entering your mission field. So let me pray before we do that. God, you are good. It's easy for me to think of how awesome Joseph is and act like he's the hero of the story, but really, God, you're the hero of the story. Ultimately, your faithfulness is the hero. I'm often tempted when I don't see things going my way to want to become the hero of my own story, to want to doubt your goodness, to want to fall into disobedience. But God, would you protect me from that? Would you protect my family here from that? God, thank you for the great hope that is found in your Son, Jesus. Though while we were still sinners, you came and died for us. Though we were the people that sent you to the cross, you said, hey, I don't want you to stay there and stay stuck, but I'm going to give you eternal life and let my Spirit live inside of you so that we could have hope that we can deal to the world. God, thank you for that. Thank you for your goodness. Pray this in your holy, humble name. Amen. Amen, friends. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're so grateful for you. We love you, and we will see you next week.